Hey everyone, and welcome to Risky Business. My name's Patrick Gray. We've got a great show for you today. We're going to be chatting with Adam Boileau in just a moment about all of the week's news, and then we're going to be hearing from this week's sponsor, Sublime Security. Sublime makes, I guess, the contemporary email security platform, like it's the most modern one, and lets you do things like write your own detections, and it has like amazing customizations and whatnot. And Sublime's co-founder and chief executive Josh Kamju is this week's sponsor guest, and he'll be joining us to talk about how attackers are abusing trusted services these days, and they're really getting quite creative. He's got a laundry list of really, frankly, quite cool tricks that spammers and hackers are using via email and using trusted services. And he'll also talk a little bit about like what email providers can do to deal with them, because it's hard, right? So that's a fun chat, and it's coming up soon. But first up, it is time for a check of the week's security news with Adam Boileau. And mate, we're going to start with, but not get bogged down in, some news from the United States, which is that Elon Musk has assembled a team of bright young things who are sort of forcibly taking over various arms of the US government and doing God knows what with the data. Now, as much as I think that, you know, US government systems could, having dealt with them recently to renew a visa, could do with a kick in the pants and maybe some re-engineering by said bright young things, you would have to worry about the data governance side of what's happening at the moment.
Yeah, it's definitely been a pretty wild ride watching some of the reporting. Reuters has a piece about the Office of Personnel Management, and Musk's people have gone in there and apparently dragged sofa beds onto the executive floor so they can sleep there and work around the clock, and are going through doing things that feel very, quite reminiscent of what happened at Twitter, which, I don't feel like that went super well for them, but yeah.
Well, that depends on who you ask, right?
Exactly,
like that's
yes.
A bit of a Rorschach test right there.
Yes. But yeah, the data governance aspects of this, we've seen plenty of people concerned around, what's happening with the data, where it's going to end up, what kind of things being, kind of what it's being used for. Although on the other hand, I guess the Office of Personnel Management did famously get hacked by the Chinese as well. So, they weren't doing a super great job of managing the data, by themselves to start with. So.
Well, I don't think the argument that we should let that happen again is a solid one, to be honest. But it's not just OPM, like they've got their hands into all of these treasury systems and stuff. And yeah, it's just the possible lack of oversight here. We don't know. They might be being very careful, but you sort of just, you do wonder.
Yeah. I mean, it's possible they're doing everything right. But it's also possible that they're not. And I guess the important thing is that we don't know, which...
That's right.
Yeah, especially
right.
With OPM and Treasury, like these are important systems, and seat of the pants has its place, but I don't know if that's it.
Yeah, it's like, amateur brain surgery. I don't know, on the government's brain. Let's see how that goes. But the Treasury thing, interestingly enough, I've spoken to a few govies and policymakers and whatever about all of this, and the thing that they're concerned about is a possible like accidental default on a debt payment from the Treasury. Like stuff like that is what's keeping a lot of people up at night, because that would have potentially some serious knock-on effects. Although I do wonder, like perhaps if there's a missed payment and people explain, it was just a batch job that didn't fire or something in some new system, what would the market reaction actually be like to that? But either way, things are getting spicy in the United States. But let's move on to some more sort of bread and butter, meat and potatoes InfoSec news. We got a great write-up here from Wiz, where they've found a whole bunch of exposed data from DeepSeek, which is the Chinese AI startup that's that everybody's talking about. What I find amazing about this is it's like any accidentally massive startup. Any startup that sort of goes viral seems to have this moment where someone takes a look at their infrastructure and it's just a mess. But this is, oh boy, this is really bad. Like they're exposing basically everything, right?
Yeah, it's not super great. And Wiz does a lot of very technical, very advanced things. But in this particular case, I don't think they really needed to bring their A game. They found some database services on DeepSeek's, kind of address space. They found some, they brute forced some domain names to discover what was available, and on dev.deepseek.com, they found some stuff listing on a high port. And the thing that was listing on a high port was a database system called ClickHouse, which I guess is kind of like a Snowflake competitor, and has no auth, and has an interface where you can just browse through, in this case, port 8123, and you get a web interface where you can just type SQL queries in and run them. And so that's not great. And then this system was ingesting log data, and a bunch of the logs had API keys and query strings and all sorts of gubbins from the inside of their operation, which, yeah, when you're going viral and everyone's trying stuff out, not a super great look. But as you point out, just like every other startup. So maybe startup culture, in China is very much like startup culture in the US.
We're all just people. You know, it's that sort of story, right? But I mean, in Wiz's write-up, they're like, oh yeah, you can just straight up plug in SQL queries. And they kind of did that. And I wonder, I guess that's not controversial anymore. Like, I remember the days when you wouldn't do that because it would be considered cybercrime. And now it's just, I mean, they've got some line in there about how, oh, we just enumerated stuff like to adhere to ethical boundaries and whatever. But like, firing off a command to show tables, like that would have been considered controversial. Not that long ago.
In the old days, you would have done that via Tor because you were doing crimes unless you had a bug bounty agreement which said that you could, because that otherwise you're doing computer crimes. But as you say, like the world has changed enough that apparently that doesn't matter anymore. You can just do as you please, and it's kind of, you rely on the discretion of the prosecutors, which I don't think American prosecutors are going to go after him for this sort of thing.
Maybe the Chinese will, but it's funny, right? So it's sort of like a cyber Overton window of what's acceptable to do. But the other funny thought I had is, like, this is normally the situation where Alex Stamos would parachute in and start writing press releases and implement some sort of program. But I don't think he can do that here because they're Chinese.
Probably not. He might be somewhat constrained about doing that over in China. But dear, one thing I thought was particularly funny in this is that ClickHouse, the database system, was actually originally developed by Yandex.ru. A Russian database, Chinese startup. I think Wiz is Israeli cloud security firm, and here we are in Australia talking about. So truly a global firm, a global industry that we're in.
A multipolar world.
Yes,
as they like to say. All right, so we're going to talk about some research from Kaspersky now. And, this one we were alerted to via our colleague Catalin Kimpanu's reporting. So this one's going out in today's newsletter edition. Go subscribe at risky.biz if you haven't already. And you can subscribe to Risky Bulletin, where you can get all of our other podcasts. Find that wherever you get your podcasts. But yeah, this is really interesting. The original post is it's in Russian. We'll drop a link into this week's show notes. But basically, some apps popped up in the iOS and, Apple's App Store and the Google Play Store that was trying to steal crypto through a really interesting technique. And I love this. Walk us through it.
Yeah, so this was a set of malicious mobile apps. There were a bunch in the Android App Store, and Kaspersky did find one using the same backdoor SDK in the Apple App Store. And what it would do is when you were using one of these apps, so the apps were like legitimate like food delivery applications. And they had a support function where you could chat with support if you had some trouble. And when you fired up the support functionality, it would ask you for access to your pictures, so that you could submit, look, here's my wrong food order or whatever else. And it would use the photo access to run optical character recognition on photos in your photo, gallery, and look for crypto recovery phrases. So it would look for patterns of, like 5 words or whatever your recovery phrase, wallet recovery phrase would have to be. And if it found something that matched that, it would upload that image off to the attacker systems, and then they would use that to recover your crypto wallet key and drain your wallet, which That's pretty clever because a lot
I mean,
of people...
you don't got to hand it to him, right? Like it's that whole vibe. And I mean, I just think who among us hasn't taken the occasional sneaky photo of a secret, right?
Well,
as a way to stash it,
right? I mean, like whether it's I'll often do that with stuff that I don't want to keep the physical object. Like sometimes it's warranty codes, or sometimes you get a device that has a setup QR code. You think, well, one day I might need this again. I'm not going to keep the box with the sticker, so why not? And yeah, I guess recovery phrases, why not? And before the age of ubiquitous machine learning, scanning of your pictures, it wouldn't have really occurred to you that someone was going to OCR stuff out of your photos. But I mean, these days Apple does that by default, right? You can search for text in your photo spool, and
you can search
honestly,
for objects too.
It's
like
if
you put car into your Apple Photos thing, it will show you all of the photos you've taken of cars.
Yeah, it's honest. I mean, machine learning sometimes actually useful. Weird.
Yeah. I wonder though if there's like some mechanical Turk thing going on, and there's a whole bunch of people in a building, just tagging them. Yeah, probably not. Just a joke there, everybody. Don't get alarmed. But look, as you pointed out, like it's a little bit unclear exactly how this malicious code got into these apps in the first place, because it does look like they're legitimate. It's it's not entirely clear, but it does look like they were legitimate apps, and possibly, and it's maybe it's the translation or whatever. It's not entirely clear, but it looks like possibly the developers of these apps used a malicious SDK. And we used to see that back in the day with like people using Xcode that they got over torrents, because downloading the actual Xcode could be a bit, of a pain or whatever. So people would just torrent it, and they'd get a Trojan version, develop their app, publish it to a store, and it would be loaded with malicious code. And I think possibly that's what's happened here.
Yeah, it could be. Like it's not super clear. I mean, one of the most prevalent app, and the one that was on the Apple App Store, it was also on the Google App Store. That one, the backdoor didn't appear until like version 2 something of the app. So it's possible that it was compromised developer or compromised supply chain, or added at some point after it had been through its initial onboarding process and vetting and so on. So yeah, we don't really know, but either way, like, makes you think twice perhaps about storing important stuff in your photo reel.
Yeah, I mean, I love that they've got a way to actually there's the dumb way to do it, which is to just look for OCR'd phrases like recovery phrase, you know what I mean, and things like that. But you do wonder if they're actually trying to identify like strings that look like they could be recovery phrases, because that's actually quite hard. That's when you've got you're almost re-implementing your own version of Trufflehog just to find crypto seed phrases or recovery phrases or whatever, and then matching it to OCR. I dig this. I'm not gonna lie. Like, I think it's
also
cool
did multi-language support. So like this was looking for phrases in like Korean and Japanese and English and Italian and Polish. Like it was actually probably quite good. And the apps they were targeting generally weren't English first language countries like they were other places around the world. So, kind of I suspect this probably worked pretty good. Yeah,
impossible to know, right? Like sometimes you see something really cool and you think, wow, they must have got paid. And you find out later they just absolutely didn't.
Very true. Very true. Yes.
And meanwhile, someone who just hacked a WordPress, you remember back in the day when people used to have initial coin offerings, and they'd host the websites for them on WordPress. Someone would just pop the WordPress and change the address for the Bitcoin, and like they'd make gajillions of dollars because no one noticed that the address had changed. But
oh god, this whole industry is so stupid.
Yeah, man. I mean, we don't really see that anymore. I mean, it's not like crypto's not going missing, but at least they have to work for it now. That was like that's a time back then. I don't know, when was that? Like last crypto boom nonsense, 6 years ago or whatever. I mean, that's a time when I was tempted to like just say, Adam, let's lead a life of crime instead.
Yeah, let's go do some crimes. Yeah.
It's all there for the taking. One WordPress shell, millions of dollars. Anyway, moving on. And the Times newspaper is serializing a book and publishing bits of it. It's about Keir Starmer, who's now the British PM. And it looks like, according to this book, his personal email address, I'm guessing some sort of webmail, Gmail, whatever, it got owned. And he was alerted by security services who just told him, don't go anywhere near that account again. Apparently he wasn't, it was very obviously his address and quite easily discoverable. So I'm guessing it had been linked to him publicly somehow. And he wasn't using MFA. And, you know, this is just what happens. In a way, this is good news, though, if they're having to go after their personal email accounts. But I don't know, that might be reading too much into it. But yeah, an unsurprising bit of news. And I guess the most fascinating thing about this is it has been reported widely, but there's no buzz around it. Like, nobody is like, oh my God, wow. You know, it is just everyday stuff these days. So that's what I found interesting about this one.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, so many people have had their email hacked at some point that maybe it doesn't seem like the big deal it used to be. And, you know, public figures. I mean, he wasn't prime minister then. He was, I think, leader of the opposition when this happened. You know, reasonable to expect him to be targeted. Reasonable that they would find a credential in a data dump that they could reuse or something like that. I did notice that the Times characterized this as a sophisticated campaign, which, you know, probably
well,
not.
I mean, he wasn't the only one targeted. I think that's sort of where they're going with this. And they make the point that, you know, there was nothing particularly tactically sensitive in there, but it would give them insight into how the leader of the opposition. So it was Russia that did this shortly after shortly after it invaded Ukraine. And, you know, the thinking is they were looking for insight into his thinking about, you know, sort of strategic affairs. And it's just a great example of how, you know, stuff that doesn't necessarily have immediate tactical value can still have strategic value, because you can start to get it. You know, you read someone's email, you start to get a sense of how they think and, you know, how they might feel about certain issues. So, yeah. Yeah,
that makes total sense. I mean, I would absolutely read people's mail spills when we were on the job, because it lets you see how the sausage is made and what's happening. And, you know, it's just useful situational awareness. So, yeah, you know, good job, Russia, I guess.
Well, anyway, moving on. And last week we spoke about that company. What were they called? PowerSchool? Yeah, PowerSchool, who make SaaS that's used for, you know, by all sorts of schools around the world, something like 16,000 of them. They got breached. It looks like they've paid. You know, the hacker sent them a video of deleting the data or whatever, but you never know. You know, sometimes they want to preserve their credibility, so they actually do it. But according to this report from Kevin Collier, there's like a leaked draft of a CrowdStrike incident report into this. And it looks like really what happened is they got creds for one staff, like no MFA. There was some like maintenance portal that they just logged into with those creds and got all of the data. And, you know, this really underlines that point I was making last week, which is that we're going to see more and more of this sort of thing targeting, you know, specialized SaaS platforms that just dominate particular sectors. And in this case, it's schools, but next time it might be hospitals, it might be psychology clinics, it might be, you know, whatever. Yeah, this ain't good.
Yeah, I mean, really just deeply, deeply underwhelming. You know, that, of course, there's a one-factor auth, you know, maintenance interface, you know, because I
mean, it's one step away from an open bucket, really.
Yes, exactly, right. And, you know, data breaches of, you know, and credential reuse are just so common and so such a widely used entry vector that, you know, this is, you know, it's just deeply predictable, and it's going to happen in every little niche SaaS provider, because, you know, you grow quickly, you don't have time to go back and clean up these things. And, you know, no one really thought that we would just put everything on the internet like this. And you know, simple stuff like 1FA actually matters these days.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some technical work that could go towards fixing this to a degree. And, you know, you look at some old approaches to things like card data, like tokenization and whatever, and you've got field encryption, and you can do stuff like distribute key mat to each individual site. And there should be things you can do to prevent this sort of thing from being quite this bad. There's going to be some engineering work involved, but I don't think the solution is just going to be more regulation, I guess is where I'm going with that.
Yeah, I mean, being more responsible steward of your data, right? Understanding that every bit of data you hold, you know, has a benefit, but also comes with liabilities, and that you have options, you know, like blinding and tokenizing and so on, to reduce the liability of the data that you need to hold to do business. And so, you know, there's, you know, not making these technical mistakes. There is regulation options, there's data minimization, like, you know, all of these things work together to just reduce the likelihood, and then failing that, reduce the impact. And yeah, that kind of blended approach is where we have to get to.
I mean, it used to be really fashionable to say data is the new oil. And then I think the person, I can't remember who it was, but someone said, no, it's the new nuclear waste, which is, it needs to be stored very carefully and it can hurt you. Now, the Record has a report up on something about Australia. This is Dorina Antoniuk has written this one up over at the Record. And the Australian government has sanctioned Terrorgram. Now, this is that Telegram channel and sort of online white supremacist group. We've spoken about them previously because after Pavel Durov was arrested, one of the first things that happened was Telegram gave up the identities of a couple of the operators of this channel. So Australia's wound up sanctioning this. And the reason this is interesting is because there's been a series of, they're absolute Nazis, these guys. And they often encourage people to commit violent acts and whatever all around the world. And there's been a spate of anti-Semitic, vandalism style attacks, right? So burned cars and someone put some petrol around a synagogue, really awful stuff, right? Spray painting swastikas on cars in Jewish neighborhoods, just the worst. And a couple of weeks ago, the Prime Minister said something curious, which is that it looked like some of the people who were doing this were actually getting paid by people outside of the country. Because you would see these arrests and it was just like trailer park meth head type people who had no sort of political ideology or motivation. And now we see these sanctions come in and various comments by political leaders here, which I don't think it's taking too much to connect the dots that this is related, right? So it looks like what might have been happening is people affiliated with this group have been paying petty criminals in Australia to do this sort of stuff, just giving them money to go and do it. And then of course, you arrest them. You can't really throw someone in prison for graffitiing a car or malicious damage of property. I mean, it depends on their record and everything, but if you can bust them for taking money from a sanctioned entity, that's 10 years. So I have a feeling that's why this has happened. And I just wanted to mention it because in the global press on this, they haven't really connected those dots.
Yeah, that kind of makes sense. That gives you an avenue to kind of take this a bit more seriously, to have to hit them in the courts with something that's a bit more serious than graffiti, right? And though obviously it's tied to kind of hate crimes. But I imagine the bar for, those kinds of, prosecuting people for hate crime is probably a little more
especially when they're not actually ideologically motivated. Well, yes, especially when they can say, well, I just got paid $200 to do this, Yeah. So, that's, you're sort of limited in what you can do to someone for doing that. But now I would think it's a great deal more serious.
Yeah, no, that seems like a smart move to, kind of level up give law enforcement some more options that they wouldn't have otherwise had. So yeah, interesting catch. Because when I read this at first, I didn't really, flag this as being...
Yeah, people are seeing it as symbolic. It is the first time that we've sanctioned a purely online group as well. So that's another interesting dimension to this. And the reason I wanted to talk about it is because we did spend a bit of time last year talking about Telegram. And I think people forget that there are, real world harms from some of these platforms that just totally YOLO it and don't do anything with law enforcement and whatever. But yeah, the Prime Minister said, what did he say? I'm reluctant to say anything that compromises investigations, but it's important that people understand where some of these attacks are coming from. And it would appear, as the AFP commissioner said yesterday, that some of these are being perpetrated by people who don't have a particular issue, aren't motivated by an ideology, but are paid actors. And indeed, our foreign minister was asked whether or not there was a link here. And they said, yeah, she said the same thing. I'm not going to get into ongoing investigations because blah, 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 blah. But this is an online network which is all about extremism, white supremacists, people who spread hate. And so we have to use all the tools at our disposal to keep people safe. So you do just sort of get the impression they did this for a reason and it wasn't just symbolic. So I thought that was interesting. Moving on, and WhatsApp says Paragon, which is that Israeli spyware company that was recently bought by US interests for something like $900 million. It turns out they'd been targeting a bunch of journalists and people who worked for NGOs, civil society groups, which is, somewhat NSO of them.
Yes, exactly. They had something like WhatsApp, minimal interaction, like zero-click kind of thing, where they would drop a PDF on you via WhatsApp, and that would lead to code exec on your device and onwards to compromise, which, yeah, if you're trying to be a slightly more legit than NSO spyware company, having a whole bunch of journalists get that is not super great. And we've obviously seen, WhatsApp go after NSO in the courts, and I guess this was sort of a, you get the feeling this was kind of a bit of a warning shot across the bows. But then we also had a piece from was it Lorenzo over at TechCrunch?
Yeah.
Saying that Paragon has said that the US government is one of their customers. So that's also a sort of a not super surprising, but B, kind of an interesting difference to kind of how NSO have gone. Like the Paragon was saying, like, we only sell to good governments and, Western interests and so on, which of course NSO has said similar kinds of things. But, having the US government buying your stuff when you're owned by a US firm, and now you're, targeting journalists via US companies' products.
I mean, keep in mind this acquisition is very recent, so we're not sure that it happened while under US ownership. I also wonder if this complicates their deal. If there's earn-out periods or like warranties or whatever, like that could get complicated for the people who've done this deal, depending on what warranties they've made to their American buyers. I would have said previously that regardless, them being sold to the United States interests will sort of bring them under the umbrella of the US legal system, and it would probably, clean them up a little if they had been doing naughty stuff previously. I think all bets are off at the moment with the way the US government's heading, though.
Well, yeah, exactly. I guess it's hard to predict at the moment. I mean, I guess in Paragon, when they were talked to by media about this, said that their terms and conditions prevent their customers from doing this kind of thing, and they shouldn't be able to target civil society and journalists and blah, 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 blah. So, I guess we'll see how this develops. And as you say, the US, who knows?
Who knows? But keep in mind, Donald Trump is not a king. There are, other politicians with power in the United States, and we might see various committees and whatever look into this eventually. But it's a tumultuous time.
It is.
Let's just say that. Now, we've covered this here and there. Suzanne Smelly has a report up for The Record. The former Polish justice minister has been arrested for signing off on the use of spyware to target like political opponents and whatever. Poland is still cleaning up after the previous government's, crazy use of spyware within their own borders. And this is just the latest development in that. So there is some accountability here. And, ties back to the previous piece, right? Where things could get a little bit out of hand under Trump, depending on who wins the election in 4 years from now. Do you really want to roll the dice on doing a whole bunch of stuff that a future government in the United States won't like? And you might get Poland, you might get the same treatment as the former Polish justice minister, is what I'm getting at there.
Yeah. And it is really nice to see the Polish government going through this process, because, we've seen other places in the world where there hasn't really been the appetite to go pull this thread, and the Poles are doing it, which good on them, because it was it's pretty egregious, and if it warns other people, makes them think a little bit, then great.
Well, I think it's pretty easy for them politically to target their opposition, right? Like they win the election, they go after the last people. But, if they've committed genuine misdeeds, genuine crimes, then, fair enough. Now, last week we briefly touched on the issue of cable breaks in various oceans and seas. And we said at the time, we don't know whether this is deliberate or not. The Swedish government had detained a ship for a while to investigate whether or not it had deliberately broken cables. They've now released that ship and said that it was clearly not sabotage. So still as clear as mud.
Yes, I mean, the Swedish authorities are pretty clear that in this case it was incompetence. So I guess that's nice. You get sent.
You were wondering, like, how do you drag your anchor for, miles and miles and miles and not notice? Apparently, it's possible.
Yeah, so apparently being a bad mariner and bad infrastructure and bad, seamanship or whatever else they said about it. So, yeah, not great for your resume as a mariner, but no longer being detained by the Swedes. So, I guess that's probably a win for them, the crew of the ship.
I mean, being detained by the Swedes would probably be quite nice if you're used to spending your time on a, large boat that smells like diesel.
A Russian tramp steamer, yes. That's probably...
I'm guessing there would be potted plants and Tai Chi in the mornings. It's Sweden.
Yeah,
it's Sweden.
Sounds good.
Now, let's talk about this huge flap about these medical devices. CISA put out this big warning saying that the Context CMS 8000 devices, which are used to do patient monitoring in healthcare, like I'm guessing heart rate and whatever, it, quietly sent patient data to a remote IP address and downloads and executes files on the device. So big song and dance about this. We got a report here from Lawrence Abrams over at Bleeping Computer, and he's updated his to say a report from a company called Clarity says that what CISA is warning about is just the auto update mechanism for these devices, and to activate it you need to reboot it while holding a button. And what are you talking about, CISA? So awkward.
Yeah, this is a little bit embarrassing for CISA, because the initial reporting was quite breathless, and they had some screenshots of, oh my god, patient data, being sent across the network. And then there was a little detail which said, and then they use NFS to, and I'm like, excuse me, what now? No hacker is going to rely on NFS to deliver their data across the internet. That's a terrible idea, because you're just not going to get very many callbacks, because NFS is going to get, blocked in all sorts of places. It's a terrible idea. And so that, to me, didn't ring super authentic. It's, smelt like, maybe someone was just, maybe an intern or whatever. I hadn't thought it through.
I can confirm that when this first popped up in one of our Risky Bulletin newsletters and we were preparing the podcast script for that day, you did express reservations. You're like, I don't know about this one. I don't think this looks like malware. So you were ahead on this.
Yeah, well, you just got that kind of spidey sense, for that doesn't... I wouldn't do that, and I'm a hacker. Anyway, so Clarity bought one of these devices, popped the flash chip off its main board, dumped the flash out, reverse engineered the firmware, went and dug up the kind of functionality that implements this, and it actually is just upgrade functionality. And in fact, the IP address in question is in the manual.
Yeah.
Which... if
you're doing a secret data exfiltration operation, you wouldn't necessarily put the IP address in the manual. And, I'll just read a comment here from the report as quoted by Lawrence Abrams. Although the full update process is very dangerous and risky, to us it does not appear to have a malicious intent behind it, especially when considering the manual boldly refers to this IP address and white label vendors ask users to configure their internal CMS with this IP address.
Yeah, so that's... I feel like for CISA, this is a bit of a, it's a bit embarrassing, because, so many times we are relying on advice from government agencies or whatever else that do have classified sources. They have, things that we as general public can't see. And there's a degree of, look, we just have to trust them to get it right, because obviously they can't share all of the source material with us. And there's a degree of, we just have to, accept that. But then it's kind of incumbent upon them to put out good information and not do dumb analysis. But
everybody makes mistakes, Adam, us included. And, sometimes you just got to chalk it up to, well, they made a mistake.
Yeah, and they did. But yeah. Oh dear.
Yeah, I think the reason you're particularly firm on this one is because, as I say, you immediately saw that and said, oh, shit.
Yeah,
basically.
Right.
Yeah. So let's talk about this 0-day vuln in Zyxel. Is that how you actually say it, or is it Zyxel? Or
I've always said Zyxel.
Zyxel.
I think that's what I write in the pronunciation notes for Risky Bulletin. So if I'm wrong, then
then you're wrong big,
yes.
As it turns out. Yeah. So Grey Noise wrote a post about mass exploitation of these devices. I guess they're like home routers or whatever, right?
Yeah, Zyxel makes a bunch of that kind of thing, home routers and things. This one I think was interesting because Vulncheck originally found the bug, publicized it, reported it to Zyxel, who just haven't patched it. I don't know whether the devices are end of life or whatever. There's no real information. Then Grey Noise saw mass exploitation start to kick off. I think this got added to one of the Mirai variants. So it's, hitting the internet, and there's a bunch of devices that are vulnerable out there. But yeah, Zyxel just haven't really publicized it, haven't patched it. So yeah, Grey Noise was blowing the whistle a little bit, saying, hey, pay attention.
Yeah. So is this like Discord kids or state vaxxed behavior. Who knows these
Why not-
days,
why
right?
not
When it comes to
both?
this. Why not both? Exactly. What else have we got here? Now this is one where, again, I don't, it's all Greek to me, but talk to us about this AMD research out of Google Security, which looks at, what is it, like being able to update CPUs with like malicious microcode? Is that about?
This is the research. I think this only got dropped, I think like today or yesterday. So pretty recently, AMD have published an advisory. There's not really any details yet, but what Google has reported and demonstrated is the ability to, as a like ring zero, so like root or administrator on an operating system running on AMD Zen CPUs, they can patch the microcode, patch the firmware of the CPUs, and that lets you do basically anything. And the Google's demo is they change it so that the ID rand instruction, which returns random numbers, always returns 4. And the bug appears to be some kind of like either hash collision or like Google described as, an insecure hashing process when they're validating the microcode patches. The specifics we'll have to wait and see once Google does actually drop those. But yeah, like great research. And obviously in a cloud environment, this is a thing where you could probably do this in a guest VM, but you're patching the CPU microcode that is shared across other instances or up in the hypervisor. So interesting class of bug, and the sort of thing that you would expect Google to be paying attention to, given that they operate, large public cloud. So cool research.
They have a few computers.
They do have one or two CPU cores to worry about, I am sure. But yeah, good work them. And yeah, like cool bug.
Yeah, nice. Now let's talk about a 22-year-old in Canada who can control smart contracts. He stole $65 million like by manipulating smart contracts, but then gets caught in a really, really dumb way.
Dear, yes. So a while ago, we talked about an attack on a blockchain crypto thingy called KyberSwap, KYBER, and this guy from Canada called Andian Medjevic, 22, had come up with a bug where he could kind of manipulate
Medjedovic, I think. Medjedovic. Yeah. But yes,
anyway. He could manipulate some smart contracts and basically use that to drain a pool of equity run by KyberSwap. And he stole, $40-ish million, $48.8 million worth of cryptocurrency using this. And he did basically similar kinds of tricks where he would take out a big flash loan, use that to manipulate the value of a pool of cryptocurrency that smart contracts are operating on, and then kind of trick them basically through a rounding error into making a transaction that was beneficial to him. He stole a bunch of money. He then went onwards to try and launder it through various mixers and so on, extracted a bunch, and he has now been indicted by the US, but he's on the lam. He's on the run with, we don't really know how much cryptocurrency, but unfortunately for him, when he went to go and launder these funds, some of it was being blocked because the people had blacklisted the source of the funds in the exchanges and so on, and he was actually submitting like support tickets to the exchange, threatening to call the police on them if they didn't launder his funds for him, which I don't know how that worked, and bribing them to launder his funds. And one of the people that he struck up a relationship with in this process turned out to be an undercover cop, which may not go well for him if he gets arrested, if they actually figure out where he's got to. But yeah, the story is pretty grim because he was like had a master's in math from some university in Canada, and he had these detailed schemes, and he made lots of notes about his criminal conspiracy, about how he was going to launder it and how he was going to get away with it, so on and so forth. But yeah, we will see whether his very smart but not very you don't get social adept from the indictment notes. We'll see whether that stands him in good step while he's on the run.
Now, finally, Adam, we're just going to preview this one because our colleague Tom Uren is writing up. This is one of the things he's looking at for tomorrow's Seriously Risky Business newsletter, and I'll be talking about it with him in detail tomorrow. Again, head to risky.biz and subscribe to both the Risky Bulletin newsletters and and podcast feed. But yeah, and NCSC, I think this goes back to, January 28th. So it is very, very recent. They have written some guidance on what is a forgivable vulnerability and what is not a forgivable vulnerability. And you really get the sense that this is targeted towards the makers of these edge devices, like your Palo Altos, your Fortinets, your Avantis. Like, that's what this feels like to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really love that characterization, because it's so easy to weasel on CVSS scores or weasel on technicalities. But I think like forgivable versus unforgivable really nails the thing that's aggravating when you read about some of these bugs, right? I mean, you know, especially like the Fortinets and the Avantis, you read them and you just go like, how can you possibly do this and still be in business? So I like this characterization, and it speaks to me.
Yes, I'll be going over that with Tom tomorrow, because I think, this could really inform policy, this sort of thing. It's about time someone actually sat down and explained in simple terms, like, you can have a bug in this and it's not the end of the world. Like, even a serious bug, if it was like a whole bunch of weird stuff happened, and, there are even high CVSS bugs can be forgivable, and there are others that aren't. And I don't know that that's something that's well understood by the sort of people who are responsible for making the laws and regulating this space. So well done, NCSC. But mate, that is it for the week's news. Thank you so much for joining me to chat about it all. Always a fun time, and we'll catch you again next week.
Yeah, thanks very much, Pat. I will talk to you then.
That was Adam Boileau there with a look at the week's security news. We're going to hear from this week's sponsor guest now, which is Josh Camdew from Sublime Security. He's a co-founder and the chief executive there. And a full disclaimer, I am also an advisor to Sublime Security. So Sublime makes the most modern sort of kick-ass email security platform that there is these days. So one of the things that makes it different is it's sort of customized per environment, and you can do things like write your own detection rules, do threat hunting. It's just a modern redevelopment of a email security platform, and it's sort of like what email security platforms should be this day. And obviously they're in the coalface now. They've got a bunch of customers, and yeah, they see all of the cool new stuff, all of the new attacks that are hitting their users and hitting them as well, as you'll hear, like DocuSign abuse, to send malicious stuff to people through DocuSign. But it turns out this is a big trend at the moment, is people using trusted services to distribute malicious stuff. So here is Josh Camdew to walk us through how some of the bad actors out there are actually abusing trusted services to do all sorts of creative things. Enjoy.
Ultimately, the idea is to blend in with normal behavior, normal traffic to evade detection. And the translation to the email layer is leveraging similar types of trusted infrastructure that you see legitimately being sent to and from an organization's email domain. So examples of this are like DocuSign or SharePoint or Dropbox or Google Drive. So there's a lot of overlap actually between the types of services that we see malware abuse that we also see adversaries use to send email attacks.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking as you were talking that the sort of phase one of this would have just been people hosting malware on trusted domains. Like OneDrive malware was a big thing for a long time, right? Like huge.
Yeah.
And now they're going one step further and actually generating mails from those types of services, and that's the mail part as well, right? So how does that work?
Yeah, so we see a few different types of abuse. There's really two categories of trusted infrastructure abuse that we see. There is the infrastructure abuse that ends up delivering mail from the trusted infrastructure service itself as the sender. So that's where you receive an email from DocuSign.net, and it's literally from DocuSign.net. It's passing all sender authentication, SPF, DKIM, DMARC. So that's category one of the abuse that we see. And then the category two is the infra abuse of links embedded in the message. So we see for malware delivery, like link-based malware delivery in particular, or credential phishing delivery, we end up seeing sites hosted on DocuSign, on SharePoint, on even Freshdesk or Zendesk subdomains. And so these are all inheriting the reputation of these legitimate services. So they tend to be much more difficult to detect.
I mean, you haven't mentioned the big one, which is Cloudflare, where...
Oh my God, don't get me started with Cloudflare. God, there's so much of Cloudflare.
Like, it is amazing, like, how much badness there is on Cloudflare. And, like, you know, just with the flexibility of their CDN, like, people are actually hosting fully featured phishing sites on, like, you know, trusted Cloudflare domains. So, yeah, I mean, as a detection signal, it's hard enough to figure out when a mail is bad when it's only got legitimate links in it. But when you've then got the added complexity of the messages themselves coming from trusted services, from actually DocuSigns, and, you know, I've got a blog post of yours that I'm going to link through to so people can have a look at it themselves. But it shows that, you know, you can deliver like a PDF through DocuSign that it's like click, click, click through, and then eventually takes you to like Credfish or whatever. So it's like an end-to-end attack handled on DocuSign. I mean, how do you deal with that as a company that's like filtering email? I'm guessing it's going to be deep inspection of those sort of payloads. And are there any complexities there? Like, you know, you operating a mail server or a mail security platform, can you go and then get that PDF and then analyze it? And I'm guessing that's the game, right?
We can, so it's really tricky, and we've seen other folks get this wrong recently, and it's caused a ton of pain. We've seen, like, there's been Google in particular has been really causing like a lot of frustration here, as we've seen DocuSign in particular get abused. Even us, like, as you know, our company, we've seen tons of like legit DocuSigns for our sales team literally getting sent to spam by Google, and we're hearing this from like a lot of other people as well.
I mean, this is exactly what a startup needs, is signed purchase orders being deleted, right? Like, thank you, Google.
No, seriously. Like, we see these like DocuSigns that are just sitting in spam for the last like week or 2 weeks. And some of these are like legitimate communications that are getting sent after like multiple replies from the sender. I mean, it's really hard basically to solve this purely using like a global ML model, basically, because so much gets scooped up with that, because there's so much legitimate mail coming from DocuSign. So you have to really get granular and know what specific signals that you're looking for. So when we saw this, you know, the way Sublime works is, you know, we've got our models that run behind the scenes, but we have a detection, we have an abstraction layer above our models that lets us describe attacker behavior, and we can push that out to all of our customers. So it's a DSL, so our team can actually build really granular behavioral detections. So when we see this like evolution of DocuSign, we can build a really targeted detection that says, okay, when we see a message come from DocuSign and it's passing sender authentication, so all the checks are green there, but the reply to domain is a domain that you've never spoken to before, because that's what a lot of them will do, is they'll set the reply to domain. So if you reply, they'll get the response, the attacker
and then
will
they
get the
can
response.
say, yes, no, this is absolutely a legitimate document. Please go ahead and
please. This is all legit. Exactly. So we can actually get granular with the signals and say, this is a recently registered reply to domain. We can go out to the link, and if we see like a PDF icon that, you know, they're impersonating a PDF document on the legitimate DocuSign document, we can like detect that as a signal. So we can adapt really, really rapidly to any changes in the landscape that we see, and we can push that out to our customers. So you really have to have a granular detection engine to do this super well.
Well, and often
at least
you can't
do it quickly.
And often you can't even get to the payload, right? Because they put them behind things, or the final phishing page, because they put them behind things like Turnstile, right?
That's right. That's right. So, in which case, you really need to use the fact that it's hosted on Cloudflare as a signal.
Well, this is actually what I was going to ask you. I was thinking, surely if there's a DocuSign thing with a link in it that goes and hits a Turnstile, like, I'm thinking that's actually a pretty solid signal that.
Well, but the thing, exactly. You have to be able to go out to the link in the DocuSign and it's actually the actual payload is hosted on DocuSign.net, like a document that you sign. So they actually are creating a template in DocuSign that you send. You click on like, yes, I want to sign. It opens up DocuSign.net. There's like a fake PDF there, and then you click, and then it goes to wherever, Cloudflare, Turnstile, or whatever. So yeah, if you can get multiple layers deep there and see where it's going, you're good.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's always like that with mail, right? You've got your big signals, your medium signals, and then you start getting a little bit more granular. And I think that's really where most mail providers compete, right? It's less on the big stuff and more on the little stuff. Although, the example you just gave of Google, like they're kind of failing at the big one there.
It's tough. It's a tough problem to solve with just training a model. Yeah.
So talk to us too. You sent me something about using legitimate sites distribution lists or something. It was something that I don't completely understand. Explain this one to me, please, Josh.
This was super clever. So it's a way that we've seen an evolution of the abuse of these infrastructure services to send it at mass volume without getting blocked by the provider. So if I start to abuse DocuSign, let's say, or PayPal, or Microsoft, or whatever it might be, and I start to send like thousands and thousands of messages, some of those services will have by now had some like volumetric detection to say, hey, you can't send this many in this short a period of time or something. Not all of them have that, to be clear, but some of them do.
Well, they will eventually, right? Because
they will eventually.
This is the trend, you know what I mean?
Exactly.
Like it's everyone's having their happy time right now using this as a vector, and then eventually it turns into enough of a headache for the providers that they have to rate limit it.
That's right. So what we started to see is kind of clever. So they would go into Microsoft and they would create a distribution list. So they would spin up an account, they would create a DL, and they would add all of their targets to that distribution list. And then they would go into whatever service that they were abusing, whether it's like, I'm going to send a callback phish through PayPal, or I'm going to send a fake Microsoft invoice. I'm going to abuse Microsoft invoicing to send it to them. So they'll send it from PayPal to the DL, and then the DL will fan out from there. So from the infrastructure, from the trusted services perspective, you're only sending one message, and then the DL does
from
what a
like
DL
Microsoft's
does,
perspective,
and they're just like, this is what a DL does. It just fans out. So super.
So tell me
clever.
how like a callback phish with tell me how I can generate a callback phish with something like PayPal and why I might do that. Like what sort of control does an attacker have over those sort of messages?
Yeah, so you would basically go into PayPal and you would generate an invoice for a quote unquote customer, and in that invoice you would embed a phone number for like customer support, or if you don't recognize this, or PayPal support. There's a bunch of different variants of this. And then there would be a charge of like $500 or something, whatever. And so that, and then you click send, and it sends the invoice to the DL or to the target, and then they end up calling the number. And then for callback phish, it's typically like a rat that they're installing, and then there's a lot of consequences from there.
So they click? I mean, there's a phone number, but is there also a link there or something where they can click through, and that's where they get malware?
Typically not for callback phish. So callback phish will be like the payload list style, which is actually why it was such a big deal, and still continues to be. So there's no link, there's no malware directly on the email. It gets delivered after you call the phone number, and it gets routed to one of these scam centers.
Okay, right. So that's how
and
they do
then
it.
They are like, hey, like happy to support you. Install this, remote access tool. And then they have control over your computer, and then they'll do all sorts of nefarious things from there.
So before we wrap it up, Josh, you've built a few, we got some platform updates to talk about. Basically, you've got some, improved incident response features, and sender domain exclusions, which, just to make life a bit easier. Just give us a quick rundown on the latest bells and whistles in Sublime.
Oh yeah, so we've released some pretty rad stuff recently. The most recent one is our fuzzy grouping algorithm. So this is a way that we cluster similar campaigns together. So if you imagine in particular for like mass volume attack, spray and pray type stuff where you're hitting like thousands of people at an org, they're typically targeted or tailored to each one. So like there's the first name and there's like some special, the subject is customized and there's like all kinds of different variations that you might see. So we built a clustering algorithm that'll be able to see all those changes and like cluster those together. And so we can basically present those we can remediate them all at once, and then we can present those to analysts if and when they want to review it in a single alert. So they're not seeing like 1,000 or 10,000, or their SOC is not getting like 1,000 alerts. So that's a really cool one. It just makes in IR more efficient too. Like if you're looking for a campaign, you'll see all of them at once, and you can see if it was remediated or remediate it with one click if you want. So that's one of the big ones. We also released some really cool new reporting for tactics and techniques that we see hitting an environment. So we have this taxonomy that we've created that describes that's super like granular, and it describes like the tactics and techniques or the attack type of the attack. And we started to show that in our reporting now. So you can see, hey, I'm getting hit with like QR codes or PDF links to PDFs or HTML smuggling. You can get down to the actual tactics and techniques being used. And then there's a bunch more, but the last one I'll mention is the sender domain exclusions, which is just this like huge pain point that people would typically have with any sort of real-time detection engine, really, but in particular with email security, is when you have a false positive, and everyone has false positives, what happens when you have a false positive? Well, typically you end up just filing a ticket and then waiting for it to be resolved one day. We released a super granular exclusions feature where in 2 clicks you can just mitigate at a really granular level without creating a global exclusion. So it's like specifically for this behavior, we will no longer flag it. So it lets you instantly resolve false positives. So that's a really, really rad one that we also released recently.
Awesome. All right. Well, Josh Kamju, thank you so much for joining me. It's always good to see you, my friend. And we'll be chatting again a bunch of times throughout 2025.
It's so good to see you. Thanks for having me on.
That was Josh Kamju there from Sublime Security with this week's sponsor interview. And that is it for this week's show. I do hope you enjoyed it. I'll be back tomorrow in the Risky Bulletin podcast feed with my weekly discussion with Tom Uren about his newsletter. But until then, I've been Patrick Gray. Thanks for listening.